Start in that case. My name's Ali Fraser. I work at Glasgow University with and for the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research. I was once upon a time a director of that fine establishment, but I've now passed that honour on to my good friend and colleague Julie Berg, who's joining us this morning. And Julie has kindly invited Dr. Irvin to join us this afternoon, I should say. Irvin is an associate professor of criminology at the University of Cape Town and a member of the Centre for Criminology at the University of Cape Town, who are one of a growing list of international partners that we have at the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research. Irvin is going to be drawing on his 25 years of experience of working on issues of organised violence and gangs, gang mediation and conflict, but looking particularly at the question or the questions that have been posed by recent events in Haiti, where organised gangs appear to be stepping into the realm of politics. I've just, Irvin, found that quote, so I can give it to everyone as a start. The fifth century Roman philosopher Saint Augustine said, "What are states but large bandit bands, and what are bandit bands but small states?" With that ringing in your ears, please make Irvin full screen, and I'll hand over to him at this point. Thank you, Irvin.
Thank you very much, Alistair, Professor Fraser. Let me just say thank you. I want to say thank you to Julie and the Scottish Centre for inviting me to do this talk this afternoon. I've heard that quote of St. Augustine, but I also want to say to you, really, with the modern unification of Italy, it was bandits in the form of Giuseppe Garibaldi that united other bandits and formed the modern Italian state. So I don't think that we must view this idea of gangs being institutions that don't pose any threat. I think that they could, under certain circumstances and under certain conditions, do so. So I want to start off this talk by talking about what it is and how the production of gangs in the global south have changed in its outcomes, and what the potential and opportunities are for these gangs to change the course of history of any country. We didn't think of it like that previously, but I think we, at that point, particularly with the events in Haiti, to be able to consider that. And when we talk about the production of gangs, one can look at the work of so many different people around police and police brutality. We can look at the work of Mike Davis in Los Angeles, police corruption. We can look at drugs. We can look at the work of Philippe Bourgeois. We can look at weak states, my own work, that of Mark Shaw's, Kontos, Kainek, and other organized crime gangs that all produce other gangs. And then, of course, there's poverty. And one look at the work of Dennis Rogers and Stephen Jensen. There is politics as well that contributes to this idea of gangs entering the political realm. And what I want to do in this talk is talk about Haiti and South Africa, and why Haiti has struck me as a country that we have to consider quite seriously, the development and the trajectory of the gang landscape in Haiti. So, and what is happening there, and what we know in terms of the literature, is that transitional states and states that have moved from authoritarian to more democratic states, we find that where social controls have been lowered as a result of that transition, and here one talks about Latin American states, Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Nicaragua. This has always been followed by high crime rates, and it's not dissimilar in South Africa. Again, we have organized gangs in the global south. In the Caribbean, Haiti has suffered a number of calamities since 2010, when there was an earthquake appeared to devastate the country's infrastructure, particularly in the capital. We've had to deal with the de Villiers family legacy of corruption, Papa Doc and Baby Doc, as they were known as the two leaders of Haiti that flung Haiti deep into this abyss of poverty. And so Haiti also suffered a number of coups, and that family was deposed by an army coup when the country was seized through, the leadership was seized through a coup d'etat. In 1991, Jean-Bertrand Aristide takes over the country, and by the end of 1991, he's removed through another coup. And so it goes that there's instability in the country, despite the economy also not playing up and providing for the local population. And in 2010, to make matters worse, there is this massive 7.8 magnitude earthquake that ripped through Haiti and Port-au-Prince and destroyed much of the capital. And so during this particular period, 94 to 96, it's argued that Aristide armed the local gangs of Haiti because his presidency, when he returned, with US support, of course, the cities, Soleil, where over 300,000 lived, of course, in abject poverty, he began to arm some of the people and the gangs. And despite that poverty, they supported Aristide. However, that was not sustainable in the longer term, and government collapsed. And it's taken the United Nations to intervene in the country and a lot of international NGOs to help bring back the country from the brink and to put it back on its feet. And of course, in the city Soleil, this particular part of Port-au-Prince, where a lot of poor people lived, appears to have been abandoned by government. And what's happened in Haiti is the Brazilian contingent of the United Nations that initially led the UN contingent were unable to disarm some of these gang members. And as the state in Haiti grew weaker, its ability to exercise control was considerably weakened as a result, and people resisted. They refused to return their weapons. And it also created the conditions for smaller gangs to seize more turf and more control, creating conflict between some of the gangs. And that opportunity of gangsters being in control of large swathes of communities that are poor, that appear to have no government services, water, electricity, is not something that is isolated to Haiti. In South Africa, we've also had situations, and there are pockets of the country that that have had gangs also close down government services, particularly during conflicts. Here in our country, we've had government services, schools, municipal services, home building services, all affected by the gangs of the Cape Flats, particularly here in Cape Town. We have, in the last 4 years, had much experience with extortion, where every element of home building or the provision of services is subject to a tax, and extortion appears to have paid off. The public trust in law enforcement is very, very low, and there's an atmosphere of lawlessness that pervades communities. Just from the optics, if one looks at the pictures of the gangs in Haiti, you see these men with armed, with automatic rifles, patrolling the streets like soldiers, We don't have that level of lawlessness in South Africa, yet only in certain pockets, in certain communities, will you find that type of approach. So in our country, we do find, though, however, that political leaders are beginning to enter that particular terrain, and they're creating further divisions between communities as a way of controlling them. And that division between crime and politics, I think that that dividing line has become blurred. And so if you think of Haiti, and you think of the organized crime that exists there, the fact that the state was unable as a state to provide for its citizens, and the level of inequality in Haiti created much division, where gang leaders stepped into the vacuum that was created on the part of the state not being able to govern effectively. Thousands of people have been killed in Haiti, and the United Nations estimate that over 1.3 million people have been displaced as a result of the gang wars in Haiti in particular. Kidnappings, 1,200 people have been kidnapped over the past years, and even the United Nations could not stop that approach of gangs in Haiti. Last year, over 188 people were killed. The UN stabilization mission that was brought to Haiti between 2004 and 2007 has not in any tangible way managed to control the violence, particularly in a country where there's a huge lack of resources. And so even bringing in the military, and even the 2023 UN resolution, which approved the multinational security support mission to Haiti, by bringing in some Kenyans and they're still in Haiti at the moment, to help police the capital in particular. It's not been established and firmly established that they've managed to gain any semblance of normality. In fact, one of the latest UN reports state that 90% of Port-au-Prince is controlled by gangs. Now, that is a staggering statistic. If the capital city is controlled by gangsters, and I suppose the only saving grace here is that these are different gangs and different gang alliances. The G9 family and allies, and the G-Prep, and they don't see eye to eye. And the opportunity for politicians to work with two different groups, it makes it very difficult for them to come together. I do want to say, though, that we have not thought about it as the researchers, that gangs are ideologically committed to overthrowing the state. Now, there have been researchers that have argued this, particularly in the United States, that the gangs constitute an urban insurgency. And in order for us to kind of deal with this urban insurgency, you have to bring in the military. And so we've experimented with the military in this country to deal with the gangs over a number of years. In 2019, we've had several killings by gang members on the Cape Flats, which saw the South African president send in the military to support the police in South Africa. And so this military support to the police were welcomed by members of the communities, and there was a lot of expectation that the army was going to bring significant change. There were other periods when they were here in supporting police officers. But given the fact that the public trust in the police is low, when the army did make its appearance, it played a support role And we found as researchers that the army and the police didn't agree because they had different philosophies, policing philosophies. The army's task is not to do policing. And there's a very strict delineation of mandates as far as our constitution is concerned. And of course, there is a view that in Africa, you don't, a civilian life, you don't invite the army into civilian life. Because in Africa, our armies tend to become comfortable in civilian life and they tend to stay here through coup d'etats and so forth. And that obviously leads to wars. So there's been quite a number of opportunities for the army to show their support to the police. The fights between the leadership of the army and the police in South Africa wasn't public. Those fights happened privately, but clearly they weren't able to work together efficiently to nip the gang wars in the bud. And so there's been some research that have showed that the army's entry into the policing of gangs made no difference. And other research that have just been released shows that there's been minimal impact, because for the time that the army was in these particular communities, the crime rates slowly dissipated, but then it went up immediately after they left again. And so I do want to say, coming back to Haiti, I'm going to talk about the South African gangs in a moment. But if you look at Haiti, you've got about over 90 gangs in Port-au-Prince, and for them to control so much of the territory is a very, very worrying fact. One has to consider what it will take for the gang leaders of the different factions to talk about physically taking over control of the country, because the army and the police appears to have, not the army, but the police appear to have abandoned the Cité Soleil. When the Brazilian contingent of the United Nations were there, the army refused to go, not the army, the police refused to go back to police that particular city. And so the Brazilians were not able, or the UN were not able to exert control over that small part of Haiti. And so in South Africa, our gangs were very different, and they still are very, very, very different, because the gang landscape has changed. Where originally we've had many different gangs, over 100 gangs. The gang landscape and the controlling interests of the gangs have become smaller and more organized. And the bigger gangs in Cape Town have begun to swallow up smaller gangs. And so a lot of the gang wars that we used to see on the streets of Cape Town have also dissipated. And what we now have are the bigger gangs taking on each other. We have one gang in particular called the Fancy Boys that are fighting with the four biggest gangs in Cape Town, the Hardlings, American Sexy Boys, and Junkie Funky Kids, and they're fighting in all the communities of the Cape Flats. And hundreds of people have been killed since this war started 2 years ago. And what we're also finding is the gang war has shifted to peri-urban areas and rural areas, which we also never had before. And another feature of the gang landscape is that you have mass shootings where 5, 7, 11 people are killed in one go in one particular area. And so this is a huge concern. The other significant difference in the way that the gang landscape has changed is that they've become experts at recruiting police officers to work for them. where one would have expected police officers would recruit gang members to work for the police. This has been turned on its head. And particularly, in 2019, we had the killing of a senior colonel in the police, um, Colonel Kinnear. He was executed after the gangs used ICT to track his movements and his cell phone. They triangulated his cell phone and killed him in front of his home when he was the most vulnerable. And of course, an extortion gang was arrested for all of this. And it was found that there were far more police officers being tracked by this particular gang. And they're on trial at the moment for the murder of that police officer. So coming back to what lessons we have, do the gangs in South Africa challenge the authority of the state? I don't think that we can actually say that the gangs, despite their level of organization, are able to challenge the authority of the state at this stage. I think that they're still too fragmented. I don't think that they have sufficient manpower, although they have firearms. There's a preponderance of firearms where the police have sold firearms to the gangs. I don't think that the gangs are in this country are ideologically committed to taking over the state. If they do, or the state functions they're taking over, then it's piecemeal. Coming back to Haiti, it's possible and it's plausible that we must expect in the longer term that I think that the gang leaders in Haiti, despite the fact that appear to be controlling 90% of the space in Port-au-Prince, is an accident of history. I don't think that they originally set out to control the entire capital city. They're also not united in coming together and opposing government as one centralized unit. I think that that works in the favor of whoever wants to intervene. That said, I do think that the fragmentation is a huge opportunity, but it's also an opportunity for gang leaders to see that they can govern, because they do govern, and they govern the areas that they police. And so, whereas in our areas, gangs have reinvented themselves, not so in Haiti. Here, gangs have become business forums. They've entered the business realm, whereas in Haiti, people are at the moment pushing for political control and entering that political space, political control of local areas. Now, that has consequences, and it's contingent upon you. If you want to become a political leader, you must be able to produce the goods, people that that vote for you. And so gangs are not subject to being voted for. They force control. And so I think the fact that if you look at Haiti, what we can learn from there is that the controlling and the ceding of space, public land, public space, public buildings, is one of the biggest factors that government must not be seen to have abandoned certain areas. Gangs grow strong when they take over areas, and government must ask permission to provide services. Where the gang started this by controlling access to schools in certain areas here, what worked well here was that there were community organizations that have emerged to oppose what the gangs were doing, and they worked with government. That didn't last. What subsequently happened was that you had the growth of vigilante organizations that are now beginning to react to the gangs. We also have something else happening here, where political parties are now linking up with vigilante organizations to march in gang areas. And so in Haiti, there's also the growth of vigilante organizations of people that are opposed to what gangs do. So I do see a similarity there. And when you arm a whole people in a community, then you have to be certain that you're able to maintain, because gang wars cost money. You must be able to maintain to feed the people that work for you as a gang leader. You must give them food. You must pay some of the people that are executing. And so there's a lot of responsibility on you as a gang leader in a conventional war with your rivals. You must have access to vehicles. You must have access to resources. And in order to replenish those particular resources, the crime rate normally goes up. Let me give you an example. In our situation, when there is a gang war, the vehicles are normally stolen from areas, public areas, hospitals, shopping malls. You'll see a growth in car theft, for instance. You will see that there would be robberies of firearms in certain communities, so that firearms are far more available. And you would see bribery and corruption increase because there's a requirement for cooperation on the part of the police to look elsewhere when people are being murdered. And so similarly in Haiti, trying to extract some of these gang leaders when they control the space is quite difficult. And where have we seen this before? We've seen this before in Jamaica, in a community called Tivoli Gardens, where Christopher Dudu's Coke in 2009, there was an extradition. He was a drug dealer, but he also was a gang leader. And what he did, he set about arming the local community in Tivoli Gardens. And it required, after the request for extradition happened, more people armed themselves. And it took the joint operation of the police in Jamaica, the military, plus the US Marines over 6 months to extract him from that particular community, because there were so many people that supported him. And in the end, about 76 people were killed in that particular operation. And of course, there was a commission of inquiry, but the violence was intense. So I do see gang leaders in Haiti being able to do something similar on the community that they live in and that they control. Here is the big thing that could work in any UN brokered deal. They would not easily give up that control and cede that control. They need something in return. And I think we've reached a stage in Haiti, if there isn't a definitive intervention on the part of international organizations and the UN, and they're trying. I've just discovered that they've made an additional 5,500 individuals and soldiers available to support the UN mission there. So we are preparing, and we're seeing that the UN is digging in its heels, and so are these gang leaders. And so the other thing that is a critical indicator is the failure of governance. Where formal institutions and formal government institutions fail to govern effectively, you're going to have a problem, because somebody will fill that space if you fail to govern and you appear to have abandoned the communities that you're supposed to serve as a government. I do think that in South Africa, what is different is that we're not as advanced as Haiti in terms of pockets of communities where there is an appearance of abandonment by government. And what do I mean by government abandonment? Social services, provision of water, of health services, of education services. If government is unable to provide that, then you can say that there's a clear failure of governance. I don't think that we can say that there is no failure of governance in Haiti. I think it's there, and that is why these gangs have become so strong. For the gangs to enter the political realm and to take state power in Haiti, they would have to deliver services. And I don't think, and I'm not sure at this stage, it's too early in the research process for us to reach the conclusion that they're able to take state control and then become the new political leaders of Haiti. It's, of course, possible under certain conditions. And those certain conditions are that the gang leaders must understand that they need to unite, they need to come together, and they must have a will to rebuild the country. That is not so simple. They have to form an alliance with the established political parties. They have to find the funding and the resources to implement this plan. If they do so, I can't see how the UN and the established political leaders in Haiti is going to succeed without bloodshed. They can't succeed because they have to physically remove these gang leaders. But the structural conditions that has thrown up and created these gangs and reproduced them are still in place. So there's a lot of work to be done in the area. I do think the parties to the conflict in Haiti have not reached that point where they see the opportunity. They're only defending their space. A second indicator here is, are we seeing, as Manwaring and Sullivan argue, an urban insurgency in Haiti? Some would argue very strongly, as the two of them would argue, that this is indicative of what they've been saying all of the years, that this is an urban insurgency and a criminal insurgency. So I do think that there are parts of that that could be plausible and apply to the Haiti situation. However, the sustainability of that particular approach in the longer term, I think that's questionable. I don't think in Cape Town, South Africa, we can claim that there is an urban insurgency to overthrow the legitimate government. The legitimate government in Haiti were not overthrown by gangsters, but a combination of factors where the established political parties were unable to exercise service delivery, governance, and provide the necessary services and resources to their communities. I think what has emerged in Haiti is a situation of dual power. And dual power, we saw this in South Africa in 1993, when the ANC was ready to, or claimed it was ready to take power, and the apartheid state was too weak to exercise governance in its own name. The de Klerk government could no longer sustain their own governance because it was illegitimate. The ANC was too weak to take power. And so what you saw on the streets were community structures, vigilante structures, self-defense units emerging to physically take power through community police forums. The police really didn't know at that stage who they should be listening to. And I think that situation pertains to Haiti at the moment, because who is the ultimate authority when it comes to the implementation of decisions? It certainly is not the United Nations at this stage. I think the inability to deliver services is a critical factor, and I don't think that the issue of abandoning certain communities because of people being poor, illiterate, uneducated is something that will stand any government in good stead. I think this is the opportunity that we're seeing here, and the opportunity to remedy it would require much analysis and much intervention on the part of the structures and communities that lives in those particular communities. I want to say, just in closure, I've spoken a lot, that the gangs in Haiti are not united for now. There was only one time in South Africa when the gangs here were united. They were divided on ideological lines in terms of the prison loyalties. And that was the time in 1996 when they were attacked by the vigilante organization called Pagad. That was the only time we saw the gang leaders in this city uniting. I don't see that opportunity emerge very, very quickly, but I do think that time is running out for Haiti, where people that want negotiate settlement and want to see proper governance and delivery to the people there, they cannot wait to see that the gang leaders there unite, because something else will come from this form of governance the minute they enter this political realm. I will end there for now, if you don't mind, and I'll take questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Irvin. That was an absolutely terrific talk, a kind of a blast from the front lines of Cape Town and Haiti. I feel like fully informed about what is obviously a complex and evolving situation.